Action!
Welcome to Media and Monuments, presented by Women in Film and Video in Washington, D.C. Media and Monuments features conversations with industry professionals speaking on a range of topics of interest to screen-based media makers.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Candice Bloch.
And I'm Tara Jabbari.
And this is a special double host, double guest episode. Today, Tara and I are sitting down with the co-hosts of the long-running popular podcast, the Bechdel Cast, Caitlin Durante and Jamie Loftus.
Caitlin is a comedian who has a master's degree in screenwriting and teaches screenwriting classes online. And Jamie is a comedian, animator, actor, and Emmy-nominated TV writer.
Together, they host the Bechdel Cast, an iHeartRadio podcast in which the hosts, and sometimes a special guest, discuss the portrayal of women in movies.
Welcome to the show, ladies.
Hi. Thanks for having us. Thank you so much. Yes, my name, this is Jamie. When you hear this voice, that's who it is.
And this is Caitlin. So hello, it's me, Caitlin.
That's so you.
So classic Caitlin. And so classic Caitlin to make other people say that I have a master's degree, because I would never mention it
from
myself.
Boston University.
Mm-hmm.
We've done our research. Yeah.
Well, thank you, ladies, for coming. Can you explain what the Bechdel test is? Just in case no one knows.
All right. Yeah, we talk about it at the top of every episode. So this is, I feel like, burned into my brain. The Bechdel test is a media metric created by a queer cartoonist named Alison Bechdel. The test is often called the Bechdel-Wallace test because it was co-created with Alison Bechdel's friend Liz Wallace. There are a lot of versions of the test. It was originally created as a bit, just as a one-off in Alison Bechdel's great comic series, Dykes to Watch Out For, in the 80s. It was also originally far more like an examination of why there are so few queer people in movies, and how women never get to talk to each other. This was sort of vagified, arguably heterofied later on. And at present, the version of the test we use on the show is that the test requires that two people of a marginalized gender with names talk to each other about something other than a man for more than 2 lines of dialogue. Mm-hmm. And it's become very popular because that is such a low bar that not a lot of movies clear.
Yeah, a seemingly very low bar and a shocking amount of things that don't pass it.
Pass. The more kind of standard and basic version of the test that people, I think like most people are familiar with, is like, do two women speak to each other about something other than a man? But we found that to be too just kind of like limiting, and some movies would pass that. It feels like it's not fair that Transformers passes the Bechdel test. So
it
we
just
sort of
feel like a spiritual thing. Yeah.
Right. So we added a few like caveats of our own, and then there are other versions and other caveats. But yeah, very generally speaking, it's, do two women speak to each other about something other than a man?
And also that the show, as the show has gone on, we've sort of strayed further and further away of, I don't know, like the classic way that we can tell that someone's like, oh, I love your show. It's the show where you figure out if a movie passes the Bechdel test. You're like, well, that would be a really short show. But how, like, because it was created as a bit, it's not a comprehensive metric. And so we just sort of use it as a jumping off point to get into a more layered discussion.
Mm-hmm. And you guys also have done episodes that talk about the Vito-Russo test, the Duvernay test, I think I'm pronouncing it right, the Mako-Mori test.
Yeah.
Can you guys touch on those? And even for some of those, I hadn't heard of those tests specifically, but then I was like, oh, I know what they're talking about. But could you explain what those tests are?
Sure. The Vito-Russo test examines queer characters in movies, and I think specifically determines, are there queer characters who aren't there to just uplift the stories of straight characters. And if you removed any LGBTQ plus characters who are present in the story, would it significantly affect the narrative, the plot, or are they just sort of there as like set dressing or, something along those lines? So it requires that queer characters exist in the narrative and they be so fully integrated into the story that removing them would mean that the story would be changed significantly.
And the DuVernay test is also sort of built around the same tenets of the Bechdel test, but addresses what lack of diversity there is in movies. I think the original version of the DuVernay test was specifically about Black characters and other people of color. Do they have a fully realized character, or do they just serve as scenery or support to white protagonists? And none of these tests existed before the Bechdel test kind of entered popular discourse. So I feel like it inadvertently, kind of 20 years after it was written, prompted and challenged a lot of necessary conversation about how little representation, especially or even drawing our attention to throughout the history of the show, how surface level a lot of representation is when it even happens.
Yes, that actually kind of, you started to answer it as well already about the importance of these types of tests. And did you want to elaborate more on the importance of having these tests in general in terms of illuminating where we are and helping perhaps hopefully drive things? It's nice to see that more tests are being created. Are there some tests that you think still need to be created from as you do your reviews and things?
My feeling is that these tests are a good tool for very initially opening people's eyes to issues with representation and inclusion and intersectionality. They're never designed to be any kind of be-all, end-all, comprehensive metric. But for people who are who have never thought about it before, because I've met many, many people, especially after starting the Bechdel Cast, and because they say, "What's your job?" And I say, "Oh, God." And then I have to explain what a podcast is to some people. I have to explain what the Bechdel test is to some people because they're like, Bechdel Cast? What does that mean? So I've spent a lot of time explaining this particular test, and you can see gears turning in some people's heads. So they're like, wait a minute. Yeah, women don't talk to each other in movies a lot of the time. So it's a good tool for people who are just starting to think about this. So I do find them helpful in that way. But like Jamie was saying, we spend so little time actually talking about the Bechdel test on our show. It's usually a 3-minute or less segment of the show, and the other 2 hours per episode that we spend discussing any particular movie is just a much deeper examination of how movies, specifically movies, media in general, but for our case, movies, how they represent gender and masculinity and class and race and sexuality and mental health. And the list goes on and on and on. So we've just, again, used the Bechdel test as a jumping off point, and we use it to initiate much larger and deeper conversations about far more intersectional representations in media.
It's really, I don't know. And it's cool to, as we are still encountering new tests. And I mean, like you're saying, Caitlin, it feels very much like a tool to start a conversation and kind of open your mind and watch media with these issues in mind. And it feels like, I mean, all of these tests have done that. I mean, they've done it for me. There's a lot of, media tropes that I wasn't aware of because I was not personally affected by them. And they're, it helps sort of broaden your horizons and how many gaps in representation there are. And then on the other hand, I feel like sometimes people or expect us to kind of get like lost in the weeds of like getting militant about does it pass the Bechdel test? I've seen, however many trillions of rounds of discourse online of like, I think it was like last year, it was like Fire Island doesn't pass the Bechdel test. And you're like, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
Like, it's not.
Or there was another one about like the Lego movie. People are like, does the Lego movie pass? Because there's this one unicorn who isn't specifically gendered, but it does talk to another woman or a female character.
Oh,
so does it? And it's just like, that's not important.
Right.
We're losing the forest for the trees. Like,
exactly.
So that's why we always try to be really clear that like we value the metric. It was really helpful for us as we were, becoming writers and learning through the show. And also it's like not the end of the world if one piece of media does not pass every test.
Right.
If I can, as a listener to your podcast, and there was a lot, I listened to a few more recently in preparation for this, and I'd like to be part of the conversation. The Gone Girl. And I think not both of you, well, one of you had read the book, or maybe the guest had read the book. Somebody read the book.
I hadn't read it.
I had read the book as well. And one of the things that people, a lot of people had issues with the film and how it portrayed women and all sorts of stuff like that, from the Emily Ratajkowski character to the actual girl that goes away. Rosamund Pike's character. The Gone Girl. Arguably the best character is Margot, the sister.
Yes. The hero woman.
Carrie Coon. And all that stuff is same thing in the book. But what was interesting to me was I'm like, why I haven't heard this conversation yet, unless I brought it up. I'm like, in the book, the lawyers that the husband hires is a husband and a wife team, right? And in the film, they have Tyler Perry play the lawyer. So they use just the husband, just a man to play the lawyer.
I forgot about that.
And I'm like, it's so interesting that for this film, I'm like, you have very strong female characters. I'll give you that. Why didn't you use the wife as the lawyer? Is it because there's too many women? Because you have a twin sister, you have the wife, you have the mistress, you have, that was
there's
always
no
what
such
kind
thing.
of, I was like, I don't know, David, give me some answers. Like, so that was what I always was curious, because anytime people were like, this is awful and it's written by a woman, I'm like, yes, but if you read the book, there's actually other forms, because just as many different kinds of people there are, men, women, all sorts of stuff. Like there are women who are, not quite right in their heads, and likes to abuse the attention.
I mean, well, that speaks to something which, with screenwriting and adapting a book, there's usually characters that you have to kind of combine or leave out, or whole, storylines that end up getting
all sorts.
Budgetary or just like screen time length, unless you're like adapting it to a miniseries or something like that. There's a lot of like condensing and like making the storytelling more efficient. So I'm not surprised that they left out one of the two lawyer characters, because they're probably going to serve about the same function. So it makes sense in a screenplay / movie adaptation that you would eliminate one of them. But why is the default almost always choosing the male character over the woman?
Right. Yeah, I mean, and as we know, books and movies and the adaptations, they are two entirely different mediums. So sometimes it feels a little unfair to compare them, but to understand, it's a good discussion about what is brought forward. And you have these same questions that you ask about any film in general, even from the beginning of, does it have to be, is there anything about this particular character that has to be that particular representation? And that's what a lot of these tests bring up as questions. Like, well, did it have to be a white person? Did it have to be a man? Did it have to be, all these things where it's like, would it change the character at all if they had, a disability? All these things. So, and that's important. And you were saying that you've discovered even more of these as you've been doing this show and learning more as you go on. But just to get back to the show itself and kind of taking it to the origins, do you remember your original inspiration to start this as a podcast? And also and you can take it back farther. How did you two first meet and get to know each other and realize you could do this endeavor together?
Well, it's all kind of connected.
It's true. We recently just got back from tour, and we got tipsy at a bar in Dallas, and we're getting nostalgic about how we first met. It's really, it was an improv theater in Boston.
Okay.
But we met 10 years ago.
It was, we were both doing comedy. We met at a comedy show, and it was when I was sort of transitioning out of living in Boston and moving to LA. And then Jamie moved here a year after I did. And, we were both navigating the LA comedy scene / just life here in general. And I was like, well, as a comedian in LA, it is required by law to have a podcast. So I was like, okay, I'm going to start a podcast. What do I know anything about? The only answer to that question is movies. And I was like, well, there are already a bunch of movie podcasts. Like, what twist on that can I do? And I was already very interested in the representation of women in movies. And so I was like, okay, that's the angle. And then I approached Jamie and I was like, do you want to do this with me? And she said yes.
She said yes.
The rest is history.
Yes, 1,000 times yes.
Yeah. Well, it's a fantastic show. It's definitely one where you realize when it exists that you're like, oh, what a great idea. Like I had at one point thought that's a great way to analyze movies. I wish I had thought of that idea for a show, so instead we're just talking about media production, but it's still about film.
Yeah.
But no, it's a great show. But also in speaking about a little bit more of the specific production of it, who does your opening song? Who created that little opening music?
Oh, it was written by a pal of ours named Mike Kaplan. And the vocals are his partner, Catherine Voskresensky. So everyone's like, did you guys write and sing and perform your opening song?
We did not. And even more scandalously, we hired a man to write it. But
that's okay.
Working together too. An ally. So yeah, we started super independent. And I feel like even though we've been on a network for years now, it still functions pretty closely to when we started. We started a Patreon in 2017 just to recoup the costs of hosting the podcast at all. So, but yeah, I don't know. It still feels, I feel like we're better at our job and we've learned a lot and the show has come a long way, but it's still very much, it's like me, Caitlin, our editor, our producer, and that's basically it. It's a very small family.
Very bare bones operation, yeah.
Well, that's, it's a low bar to entry. That's why everyone has a podcast.
Right.
Because it's easy enough to do. But yeah, you guys being on for more than 7 years now is a testament to the fact that you guys have a winning combination, a good team, a great concept, and that you're producing a great show.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Do you guys, how do you guys select the films that you guys decide for each episode?
There's a bunch of different ways we go about it. Sometimes we just have a particular guest we want to have on the show and we let them choose. Sometimes there's a sequel or reboot coming out for something.
All the time.
We will
Too much.
It's happening constantly. We'll use that as an opportunity to record an episode about like whatever original version of that, because we're such
and
good...
then if they approved at all in the redo.
Right, which often kind of not
usually
sometimes, but
lateral boob.
Yeah. But we're like, wow, we're such, synergy, right? Business. So we'll do that. Other times, like for during February, we try to showcase movies made by Black filmmakers for Black History Month. During Pride Month, we'll do the same for queer filmmakers. Yeah. And then,
Pacific Islander Month. Like
October is usually spooky movie season. December, we'll do holiday movies. Sometimes it's just like, what time of year is it? And can we do an April Fool's episode?
Yeah, I mean, and it's also cool as the show's gone on, like, and we bring on new guests, because guests, we also like, we're bringing in people that we love, who we feel like our listeners really respond to and learn a lot from. And just like, it's a cool way to meet people, like it. Yeah. And I mean, often we'll have, if a writer or a performer that we admire is like releasing a new project, we'll try to find a movie that connects to those ideas. And like, we have a writer coming on soon who like recently published a book about a crime in Massachusetts. And it's like, all right, we're covering the town. And just like,
oh, nice.
I don't know. It's
crime we try, in Massachusetts. Yeah.
We try to keep a balance of like, we want to present, I think we could always do better with this, but we want to present a diverse slate of movies. We also want to present movies that people are like, our listeners are telling us they want to hear about. And we want to introduce them to new stuff and keep it fun for us as well. So sort of, there's no equation. It's a very vibes-based system.
It is nice to see that you also bounce around to newer and older films and it does seem like there's quite the variety. But speaking about those guests, when did you have guests? How early into the process were you able to bring guests on, and what have been some of your favorite guests? Because you've had some really notable ones. It sounds like a really awesome way to meet some cool people. But yeah, how did that happen? Did you need to reach a certain like level of success before certain people would come on, or how did that go?
It just started with comedians that we knew already. And so, I mean, we were already starting from a place of like, we were in our stand-ups in LA. Caitlin was running an amazing space at the time. So we were around comics all the time. We recorded at the theater as well. So it was just like, it started as just like people were around. And then as time went on, it was like, the podcast sort of found its voice a little more. We realized that certain episodes and certain movies needed specific perspectives to be provided that we didn't have and wanted to seek out. So it changed over time. And then also, I think the pandemic really changed our approach to booking, because we used to record in person again. And the pandemic sort of shifted how we booked again, because we used to generally do in-person recording, but now we record with guests from all over the world. And I feel like the show is better for it.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely one of the silver linings of the pandemic is the increase of being able to have these conversations. And logistically, people they don't have to take time to travel or do anything. They can just take literally that hour or whatever for the conversation, or more than an hour, because your shows typically run longer. You have a longer format.
Sorry about but also,
okay. There's different
you're
styles.
welcome.
Yeah.
We've got discourse to be, and that also informs some of our movie choices too. Because sometimes we're like, wow, we've covered like 4 heavy movies in a row. We just want to have fun. So then we'll do like Shrek 4. So
and then that will be like the 3-hour-long episode. You're like,
you really get into it and analyze more, and But that's the beauty of movies, right there. The fact that there's so many to choose from. Along your journey, that seems like you've had quite a long one. As you said, you've learned a lot and things have changed. Have there been any major milestones or moments that you felt like, oh, this is definitely something you're going to keep doing, you're sticking with it? Like, were there moments where you're like, oh, I guess this little thing we tried is now going to be our job, and they'll get money for it or anything?
There have been a lot of things for me, at least. I mean, being picked up by a network was something that felt like it legitimized us as a podcast and really expanded our reach. And that also, in turn, expanded our Patreon, aka Matreon, and it helped us have this be more of a full-time job than just a hobby that was hemorrhaging money, which is what it was for a little while.
For a good year or so, whatever.
Yes. And then, I don't know, just things like we've been, accepted or asked to do a number of different comedy festivals or podcast festivals. And then from that, we kind of started touring. And one of my favorite anecdotes about the show is our first ever live show was at the comedy, the Improv Comedy Theater in Boston, where Jamie and I met.
This is where we first met.
That's very fitting. That's nice.
And it was in a tiny room that only fit 30 people, and it was only half full. So there was 15 people at our first live show.
My mom was one of them.
Yes.
Nice.
She was hitting on the guest drama.
Oh, there you go. Hey, that's entertainment too. So that's good.
That's a memory.
Exactly. And now, not to brag, but we will sell out a 350-seat venue in New York City. So those are also things that
brag away. Those are really good accomplishments, and you earned them.
Exactly. I feel like the touring really is what hits it home, and because we always do meet and greets with people who come to the shows. It's just I don't know. It's so, I mean, you both know too, it's so easy to feel like you live in a little Zoom square.
Yeah.
And you're people are listening, but no, they're not. And then
they
you
might
meet
not
them.
also.
Right.
So
Right.
There's a comfort in that. Yeah.
Right. And then you get to meet people and, hear firsthand whatever, how the show has changed the way that they see movies, or how they feel, at least that they're things that they're seeing, we're validating. It was we see it too. And we live in hell.
Yeah. That was one of my questions, is also because you have started touring more regularly, it seems what has been the difference for you guys when you record in a studio or remotely, more one-on-one with you guys and a guest versus in a live show with an audience? The pros, the cons, the highs, the lows, that kind of thing.
Well, we almost always run out of time during our live shows because we try to keep them, to the 75-minute to 90-minute mark.
Yeah. Listening to a 3-hour podcast could be fun, but watching 3 static bodies on stage for 3 hours, maybe not so much.
So just move around more. Don't be so static.
We do. I mean, it really is stuff like that, though, where we'll have sort of the digest version of the conversation and then record pickups later. We'll dress up. We'll talk to audience members. We'll usually play some sort of game towards the end. And I feel like the big thing that we've learned over time is we tend to try to cover even movies that have a lot of discourse attached to them. We just covered the Barbie movie, which there's so much to talk about, but it's a fun movie to talk about. We were doing kind of bummer movies live before, and we're what's happening to the vibes are off in this room, and it's our fault.
Why
are we doing Fight Club live? Why did we do Black Swan live? I mean, it worked.
No.
Yeah.
But it was risky.
But those are interesting films to talk about. I wrote a paper on Fight Club in college. I mean, I could talk. It doesn't seem like a bummer movie to talk about, but yeah, there's a lot there. It's not maybe as fluffy and uplifting as some others could be, or straight comedies. Going back to the Patreon thing really quickly, you were saying that you record pickups and you do the tour and all that. First, how often are you recording? Because you release a regular schedule of your show, but then you also do extra ones for your Patreon members. So you've done so many. Does the Patreon add like any more pressure to keep doing it, or do you just love it and it's an opportunity to cover more? Like how does that work in terms of like your schedule and your workload? Because you've covered nearly 500 films now, according to your Letterboxd.
Scary. Scary.
Well, yeah,
we usually record like twice a week.
Oh, wow.
Once to twice a week. For a long time, I was editing every episode. And so like this podcast was literally my full-time job. I now only edit the Matreon episodes, which alleviates a lot of the work. But yeah, I mean, I love the Matreon episodes. We usually come up with a really silly theme that is awesome.
The worst idea we can think of. The matrons vote on what they think is the best worst idea. Yeah, the Matreon and it's like such a fun community that it feels like, I mean, the episodes aren't like markedly different, but they are like a little looser, a little sillier. We'll do a lot of in-jokes because we know that whoever's listening like is not listening by accident, which is nice.
Yeah, they know you already. Can you share what some of those worst ideas have been?
Yeah.
Like a couple of them?
I would be delighted.
What's the worst one to you?
Well, right now
I still
we're
think
in
the
the middle
Pinocchio
of...
Wars was our best worst idea. I love the
That was a good
Pinocchio
one.
Wars.
Do you do like a whole like bracket against movies or something and find
Should do
whittle
something
them
like
down to a
that.
champion?
Yeah, we've never done a bracket. Actually, I was like,
should do a
we
March
keep
Madness
doing.
episode one time.
There you go.
You know, and March is Women's History. You could do best like women's something. I don't know. Like, do like a suffragist, all those movies coming together.
Because there's quite a few.
These are better ideas than we've ever had because right now we're in a theme called
You can
wedding.
hire me as a producer or an idea person anytime. No.
I think right now is Wedding Webuary. Wedding movies. So we're covering 27 Dresses and Ready or Not. The month before that we did
the spectrum of wedding movies.
Yes. We've also just come off of a theme called Dance December, which we observed in January, not December, but we did some dance movies.
We've covered Portman July in March. November. Portman July has never fallen in July yet.
Is that like Natalie Portman stuff?
Correct.
Yeah. And also with the Matreon, we try to, that's where we'll cover a lot of like popular requests that Caitlin and I can comfortably cover without a guest. And so, and also just, I don't know, it's fun to do the theme. We didn't always do the theme, and then also on our birthday months, we get to pick our movies which usually at least one is like a punishment for the other of like, I will never get this through otherwise. And so now you have
that actually that brings up a good point. So, you know, Tara and I and just like everyone has differing opinions. Like art is subjective, all of this, you know, we all have different backgrounds and experiences that color our opinions. So have you found in doing this show that you guys have aligned more than you thought or disagreed more than you thought on your overall reviews of films? Or because, I mean, you were just mentioning, you know, maybe one of you wants to do a film and the other one doesn't. I mean, you clearly still have some differences, which is good. You're unique individuals. But yeah, so how do you guys align?
We contain multitudes. We have, I think that our analysis and our opinions about like from the using the context that we use to evaluate movies and critique them from a representation standpoint, I feel like we almost always agree. Like sometimes there will be like minor, like, oh, I saw this a little bit differently, or that didn't bother me so much, or something like that. But most of the time we agree. However, our tastes in movies, aside from Titanic, could not be more different because I'm all about like action, sci-fi, fantasy movies with like lots of, you know, fighting and chases and stuff like that. I don't like rom-coms. I love
rom-coms. I love musicals. I love horror movies. I love little indie movies. Yeah, we have really wildly different tastes, but that's why it's always exciting when we both are really amped on a movie. We will never shut up about it again because it feels
it's a
like
good movie, solid,
an event.
Yeah. Well, that's great. It sounds like you guys together span almost all of the genres. So it's good that someone is kind of representing each type, which is great.
I'm curious, is there a film that kind of surprised you that either passed any of the tests or did not pass? And you were like, I had no idea that I didn't realize this until we had to really dissect it for the podcast.
You had mentioned even earlier, like Transformers. So is that like, so do genres, do they sometimes, are they like misleading where something will actually pass?
And one example I always like to use is one of my favorite movies. It's Mad Max Fury Road is like...
Love that movie too.
There's, it's not perfect and it's not perfect from a representation standpoint, but it subverts a lot of tropes and harmful things when it comes to action movies. And so I cite that as one of my favorite movies, partly for that reason. And also it's just like an awesome action romp. But yeah, every once in a while something does surprise us because we go in with the expectation of, this genre is usually, doesn't handle XYZ very well. Or this director almost always, Christopher Nolan is killing off every woman who's ever been in one of his movies. Things like that. Things surprise
Nolan,
us.
You're on notice. Yeah.
They've never noticed that before.
Yeah, and
Tarantino's on notice for a number of things.
But then also occasionally they get something in there and then you're like, but then Kill Bill is one of my favorite movies.
Brown.
Right. And that's why we're always also trying to come from a place from I feel like one of the things that has remained really consistent on our show is that we're not ever coming from a shamey place where it's like, your movies are your movies. It's your life. We're not going to, we're not going to yell at you for enjoying, because we like a lot of movies that do not fare well on our show, which we've spent hours and hours talking about. What I've been enjoying lately is covering some older movies, and I've been kind of pleasantly surprised at how some classic movies have sort of fared even though like you have to take all of these, contextual things into account. But like, I really enjoyed, we recently covered Sunset Boulevard, and I was pleasantly surprised at like how prescient that movie still feels and how much it still has to say. And, it gets a little depressing because you're like, wow, the world has not improved. But it's cool to find, like, I think earlier in the show, we were sort of coming from a place where like new movies have the most interesting stuff to say. And as the show goes on, it's, there's a whole gradient there. It's kind of fun to dig into stuff like that.
That's really cool. Yeah. And it is depressing how far we still have to go on so many things.
You're like, wow, movies have, like, the world has always hated women over 40.
Yeah. But, we will still continue to advocate for and create and change and push things forward. And stuff like your show is great. We are running long on time, but I do have a question that I think is really important and kind of speaks to the overall like impact of your show. You touched on it before, but what's the overall feedback from your listeners been about like opening conversations and shedding light on these things? And do you think, like what are you seeing as the impact of your show?
We often get feedback that, in fact, I think at one of our live shows recently, because we just came back was this in Austin, Jamie? Someone came up to us, like, borderline tears in her eyes, saying, like, you really, like, empowered me to be a feminist and someone who could advocate for myself and could feel empowered in different areas of my life. And, like, I didn't think that was possible until I started listening to your show. And that's not to say that we don't get feedback that's like, hey, you might want to reconsider this, or like, check out this perspective on this thing. So we have a lot of audience members who like hold us accountable for different takes and educate us and help us and just help us keep our analysis as intersectional as possible. But yeah, I think by and large, the response has been like, thanks for, thanks, period.
Yeah, a really curt thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
No, I mean,
walk up, say thanks, and leave. Yeah,
yeah, bye.
You know why? Yeah.
I also really like we have learned a tremendous amount from our listeners over the years, and I feel I've like one of the things I'm proudest of with this show is, I mean, because we're, doing most of this communication over the internet, it has been almost never in the history of the Bechdel Cast, just like the community that we've been able, that is drawn to our show is, I think, surprisingly and uncharacteristically empathetic and genuinely wants to have a conversation versus scorekeeping or like, hey, fuck you, because I don't agree with this, which I know happens in fan bases a lot. And I've found that our fan base has been both not hesitated to let us know when we've missed something, but and in the reverse. Yeah. But it's like from a place where it's just like, but now like I appreciate that they've shown us grace and trusted us to have the vested interest in learning. And I feel like, I don't know, if our show, I feel like for some listeners, our show is like kind of a gateway drug into some some harder stuff. And I love that too. Like if this is a show that has like opened your mind and adjusted your perspective a little bit, like go with it. That's great.
That's awesome. I'm just curious, speaking of things that open eyes to people, or open eyes of, shocking statistics and things, do you have a general sense of the percentage of those hundreds of films that you've watched that do pass the Bechdel test?
No idea. I would guess.
I mean, would you say that it's like less than 25%? Or
if I could guess, I would say, less than, I would say it's about a quarter of them.
Okay.
That do
under your definition
pass.
Versus the original definition.
Yeah. Also, like, it's also sometimes it's a metric that it's kind of fluid, and sometimes we're like, even though it technically passes, it also feels spiritually like it doesn't, because there's only 30 seconds of the entire 2-hour runtime of the movie in which two women are interacting with each other about something other than a man. So even if it's a technical pass, it still feels like, okay, well, what about the other 1 hour and 59 minutes of your movie where women aren't interacting? So I would say of movies that like really, without a doubt, without any shred of doubt, that do pass and pass consistently throughout the movie, I'd say that's maybe 5% of the films we cover.
Wow.
Right.
And then
it's like it gets even trickier over time, because I feel like once the Bechdel test entered mainstream discourse in the 2010s, a lot of movies I feel like we should have some sort of term for this, where like you can tell that they added this scene so that the movie technically passes the Bechdel test, and no one's going to yell at them on the internet because they can blah, 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 blah. But the scene is easily cuttable, doesn't actually matter. The movie doesn't actually have a vested interest in stuff. It's just like, okay, don't yell at us, feminist killjoys. And it's like, well, too bad. We're going to.
Well, at least it gets the conversation started, and it's important to at least have something as a way to measure, to see the data of where we are and how far we have to go. And but yeah, so it's a great jumping off point. It's good conversation. Thank you for this conversation. It's been really illuminating to hear. There's so much more we could ask, but our show is not 2 hours long. We try to keep it closer to 30, because there's all different formats and all different styles, and we're just a shorter one.
And we'll have all your links and stuff in the show notes and things. But is there anything you wanted to plug vocally?
Well, we do have a tour coming up in May. We're doing a bunch of cities in the UK. So if you have any UK listeners, check us out. We're doing Speaking of Titanic and also Shrek, the two movies that probably come up.
Titanic tour.
Yep.
It's an obvious pairing. I mean,
it couldn't be more obvious.
Check out the poster.
The movies are identical, basically, and they are the two movies that we refer to just as a bit on the show the most frequently. So we were like, let's have fun on the tour and do these movies. So we'll be in London, Oxford, Manchester, and Edinburgh. So come to our live shows. They're a boatload of fun and a Shrek load of fun.
Well, Tara, our international traveler, may be able to see you in person sometime.
Might be able to. I'll be there in May in London.
Yeah, she bounces all around the world all the time. But speaking of that poster and the tour date and everything, just if you could let our listeners know where they can learn more about you and the show.
Yeah, you can go to our linktree/Bechdel Cast. A lot of that information is there. The ticket links to all those shows, as well as links to our social media, our Letterboxd, our Patreon, our merch store. Buy our merch. I don't know.
Why not? Yeah, they're generally, like, if you like the show, sign up for the Patreon. Come hang out with us there. It's a fun community.
Cool.
And come to shows.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with us today.
Thank you for having
us.
Our treat.
Thank you for listening to Media and Monuments, a service of Women in Film and Video. Please remember to review, rate, and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast. For more information about WIF, please visit our website at wif.org. Media and Monuments is produced by Sandra Abrams, Candice Bloch, Brandon Ferry, and Tara Jabbari, and edited by Emma Klein and Juliana Yellen, with audio production and mix by Steve Lack, Audio. For more information about our podcast, visit mediaandmonuments.com.
That's all right.